There's something that always stops me when I'm reading Ottoman history. And it's not the battles, not the conquests, not the sheer scale of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf. It's something much smaller than that, much quieter. It's a door. A specific kind of door in a specific kind of room inside the palace at Topkapi. And behind that door, for decades, sometimes longer, lived men who were princes, sons of sultans, brothers of sultans, men with royal blood, royal names, royal everything, except freedom, except power, except, in many cases, even a future.
But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand what the Ottomans eventually did to their princes, you have to understand what they were trying to solve. And the problem they were trying to solve was one that had nearly destroyed them multiple times. Here's the thing about the early Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a dynasty that inherited a clean system of succession. There was no rule that said the eldest son becomes sultan, no automatic transfer of power. When an Ottoman ruler died, what followed was less a coronation and more a race. His sons, and there could be many, from different mothers, raised in different provinces, each with their own supporters and their own armies, would essentially compete to reach the capital first. Whoever sat on the throne first and consolidated power fastest won, and the ones who lost, they died. That was understood. That was just how it worked.
It sounds brutal, and it was, but there's a cold logic to it that the Ottomans themselves would have recognized. A divided empire is a weak empire. Two princes with competing claims don't share power, they tear the state apart trying to get all of it. The Ottomans had watched that happen to other dynasties. They'd watched it nearly happen to themselves. So the solution, when Mehmed II came to power in the 15th century, was to codify something that had already been practiced informally for generations. He issued what became known as his Law of Fratricide. And it stated, more or less plainly, that whichever of his sons became sultan had not just the right, but the obligation to execute his brothers, for the welfare of the world's order. That phrase has always stayed with me, for the welfare of the world's order. Not out of cruelty, not out of ambition, but framed as a kind of grim civic duty. The new sultan killing his brothers wasn't supposed to be personal, it was supposed to be governance.
And for a while, for a long, strange while, it worked. The empire was stable, succession happened, power transferred. Yes, princes died. Yes, sometimes they were children. There's a story from 1595 that I find almost impossible to process even now, when Sultan Mehmed III took the throne and had 19 of his brothers strangled. Some of them were infants. The procession of their coffins leaving the palace was witnessed by people in Istanbul who reportedly stood in complete silence. 19 coffins. The youngest weren't even old enough to understand what was happening. But the empire didn't fracture. Power transferred cleanly, and in the ruthless mathematics of dynastic politics, that was considered, by the men making these decisions, a success.
Now, I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it's easy to read something like that and just file it away as things were different back then and move on. But I don't think that's quite right. The men ordering these executions weren't indifferent to what they were doing. Some of them were clearly haunted by it. There are accounts of sultans who drank heavily after their accession, who surrounded themselves with religious scholars seeking reassurance that what they'd done was permissible, who had the mothers of their dead brothers given pensions and treated with honor as if that could somehow balance a ledger that couldn't be balanced. They knew. They just believed they had no choice. And here's what makes this even more complicated. The practice wasn't always condemned by the people living under it. There were Ottoman religious scholars who formally endorsed the law of fratricide, who wrote treatises arguing that the stability it created saved more lives than it took, that a civil war between competing princes would kill thousands, that the deaths of a few, however terrible, were preferable to that.
You can disagree with that logic. I think most people would. But it's worth understanding that this wasn't just violence for its own sake. It was violence embedded in a theory of governance, a theory that said order has a cost and someone has to pay it.
What's fascinating, and what most people don't know, is that the Ottomans eventually decided they couldn't keep paying it. Not because they suddenly developed a moral objection, but because the practice started backfiring in ways they hadn't anticipated. By the late 16th century, the empire was running out of princes. Sultans who executed all their brothers and had only one or two sons of their own were leaving the dynasty dangerously exposed. If the sultan died young, if an heir died in childhood, the whole imperial line could simply end. A dynasty that had survived 2 centuries of warfare and conquest could be wiped out not by an enemy army, but by a fever, by bad luck, by the very system that had been designed to protect it.
So they changed the system, and what they replaced fratricide with was in some ways even stranger. They built a cage, not a metaphorical cage, a literal one, or as close to literal as a palace apartment could be. A set of rooms inside Topkapi where the male relatives of the Sultan, his brothers, his cousins, any man with a plausible claim to the throne, would live out their lives in complete isolation. No contact with the outside world, no military command, no education and governance, no wives in many periods, though this changed over time, just existence, just waiting. They called it the Kafes, the cage, and the men who lived in it could wait for years, decades. Some waited their entire lives and were buried there. Others waited and then, suddenly, without warning, were pulled out of that room and handed the most powerful throne in the Islamic world, expected to rule an empire they'd never been allowed to understand, surrounded by advisors they'd never met, making decisions with consequences they had no framework to evaluate. What happened to those men, what the cage actually produced, is where the story takes a turn that I genuinely didn't expect when I first started reading about it. Think about what it actually means to grow up in the Kafes.
You're a prince. Your blood is Ottoman. Your grandfather or your uncle was Sultan. You know in some abstract sense that you matter, that your existence is significant enough that the state has decided to keep you alive and keep you contained. But you've never ridden a horse into battle. You've never sat in a council chamber and watched men argue over taxes or troop deployments or the terms of a treaty. You've never had to make a decision where the consequences were real. What you've had in many cases is alcohol, music, the company of concubines who were specifically selected because they were older or infertile, so they couldn't produce a child who might create yet another line of succession to manage. You've had books sometimes, gardens sometimes, and you've had time. More time than almost any human being in history has ever had, with nothing required of them. Some of the men who came out of the Kafes were, by all accounts, completely broken by it. Ibrahim I, who became Sultan in 1640 after spending most of his life in the cage, reportedly didn't believe he was being brought to the throne when they came to get him. He thought he was being taken to be executed. He had to be coaxed out of his rooms, had to be reassured multiple times that this was real, that he was actually going to be Sultan, that no one was going to kill him.
He ruled for 8 years. His reign was defined by a kind of desperate, almost frantic indulgence. He was fascinated by furs, reportedly had an obsession with them that went well beyond any practical explanation, reportedly filled rooms with them. He had hundreds of concubines. He was, by most accounts of his contemporaries, unpredictable in ways that made governing genuinely difficult. He was eventually deposed and strangled by the same palace officials who had served him. He was 32 years old. Now, it would be easy and frankly a little unfair to just call Ibrahim unstable or weak, because when you actually look at what that man experienced, the question isn't why he struggled, the question is how anyone could have come out of the Kafes intact. Isolation does something to the human mind. Sustained years-long isolation, combined with the constant knowledge that your life depends entirely on the continued goodwill of a brother you never see, that's not a childhood. That's not even a life in any recognizable sense. That's something else entirely. And yet,
Some of them managed. Suleiman II came out of the Kafes in 1687 after spending roughly 39 years inside it. 39 years. He was in his late 40s by the time he became sultan, and he'd spent almost his entire adult life in those rooms. And yet his reign, while short, was considered relatively stable. He apparently had genuine religious conviction that sustained him through the isolation. He'd spent decades reading. He knew things, even if he didn't know the world. What I find so striking about both of these men and about the whole institution of the Kafes is what it reveals about what the Ottomans actually believed power was. In the early years under the law of fratricide, the logic was Darwinian in a very direct way. Let the princes compete, let the strongest win, execute the rest. Power goes to the capable, or at least to the fortunate. But the Kafes flipped that completely. Now power went to whoever survived waiting, whoever endured, whoever managed to stay alive and stay sane in a room they couldn't leave, for years they couldn't count, for a throne they might never actually reach.
It's almost a philosophical statement about what ruling requires: patience, endurance, the ability to exist with uncertainty. You could argue, and some historians have, that the Kafes was, in a weird way, a more honest preparation for rule than the violent free-for-all that preceded it. Because governing an empire is less about military genius and more about surviving the grinding, relentless, unglamorous work of administration and politics and compromise. And the men who came out of the Kafes had, at minimum, learned how to endure. There's one more layer to this that I think deserves attention, and it's the layer that most people never get to when they study Ottoman history. Because we tend to focus on the sultans, on the men who came out of the cage and took power. But there were men who went into the cage and never came out. Men who were born princes, who carried that weight their entire lives and who died in those rooms without ever being called, without ever getting to be what their blood said they were supposed to be. We don't know most of their names. They weren't recorded with any great care. They were living insurance policies kept in reserve against a need that never arrived. And I think about those men sometimes, not the famous sultans, not the ones who shaped the empire, but the ones who simply waited and were never chosen, and eventually weren't waiting anymore.
There's something about that specific form of erasure that feels like it says something important, not just about the Ottomans, but about power itself, about what it asks of the people closest to it, about the strange, terrible position of mattering just enough to be controlled, but not enough to be counted. The Kafes was finally abolished in the 19th century as the Ottoman Empire modernized and reformed. By then, it had lasted almost 300 years, and the sultans who came out of it in those final generations were educated, multilingual, trained in the arts of governance in ways their predecessors never had been. The cage had evolved into something almost like a royal school. But it had started as a prison, and for most of its existence, that's what it was. The Ottoman Empire lasted 6 centuries. It produced some of the most capable administrators and military commanders in world history, and it spent a significant portion of that time trying to solve a problem that every dynasty faces in one form or another. What do you do with the people who could have been king but weren't? What do you do with the men who are too dangerous to free and too royal to ignore?
The Ottomans tried killing them, then they tried containing them. Neither answer was clean. Neither answer was without cost. And maybe that's the thing that stays with me most when I think about all of this. Not the brutality, not the strangeness of the Kafes, but the fact that they kept trying. That generation after generation of the most powerful dynasty in the Islamic world sat with this problem and couldn't fully solve it. Power, real power, has always created this. A circle of people close enough to touch it, but not allowed to hold it. And the history of what happens to those people, that's a story that never really ends.